The Mask of Anarchy is a British political poem written in 1819 by Percy Bysshe Shelley, following the massacre by British troops at St. Peter's Field in Manchester on the 16th of August, 1819, when the British cavalry charged into a crowd of 60 to 80,000 who had gathered to demand the reform of parliamentary representation. In its call for freedom, it is perhaps the first modern statement of the principle of nonviolent resistance. Mask, in this case, means a political demonstration or parade, and anarchy here means a state of lawlessness in which the rich and powerful are freely able to control all religious, state, and legal power. Their laws preserve their own freedom to exploit. The foreign minister, referred to at the beginning of the poem, at the time of the massacre was Viscount Castlereagh. The Mask of Anarchy. As I lay asleep in Italy, there came a voice from over the sea, and with great power it forth led me to walk in the visions of poesy. I met Murder on the way. He had a mask like Castlereagh. Very smooth he looked and grim. Several bloodhounds followed him. All were fat, and well they might be in admirable plight, for one by one and two by two, he tossed them human hearts to chew, which from his wide cloak he drew. Next came Fraud, and he had on, like Eldon, an ermine gown. His big tears, for he wept well, turned to millstones as they fell. And the little children who round his feet played to and fro, thinking every tear a gem, had their brains knocked out by them. Clothed with the Bible as with light and the shadows of the night, like Sidmouth necks, hypocrisy on a crocodile rode by. And many more destructions played in this ghastly masquerade, all disguised even to the eyes, like bishops, lawyers, peers, or spies. Last came Anarchy. He rode on a white horse splashed with blood. He was pale even to his lips, like death in the apocalypse. And he wore a kingly crown, and in his grasp a scepter shone. On his brow this mark I saw, I am God and King and Law. With a pace stately and fast, over English land he passed, trampling to a mire of blood the adoring multitude. And a mighty troop around, with their trampling shook the ground, waving each a bloody sword for the service of their Lord. And with glorious triumph they rode through England proud and gay, drunk as with intoxication of the wine of desolation. O'er fields and towns from sea to sea, past a pageant swift and free, tearing up and trampling down, till they came to London town. And each dweller panic-stricken felt his heart with terror sicken, hearing the tempestuous cry of the triumph of anarchy. For with pomp to meet him came, clothed in arms like blood and flame, the hired murderers who did sing, Thou art God and Law and King. We have waited weak and lone for thy coming, mighty one. Our purses are empty, our swords are cold. Give us glory and blood and gold. Lawyers and priests, a motley crowd, to the earth their pale brows bowed, like a dead prayer not over loud, whispering, Thou art Ard and God. They all cried with one accord, Thou art King and God and Lord. Anarchy, to thee we bow, be thy name made holy now. And Anarchy, the skeleton, bowed and grinned to every one, as well as if his education had cost him 10 millions to the nation. For he knew the palaces of our kings were rightly his the scepter, crown, and globe, and the gold inwoven robe. So he sent his slaves before to seize upon the bank and tower, and was proceeding with intent to meet his pensioned parliament, when one fled past, a maniac maid, and her name was Hope, she said. But she looked more like despair, and she cried out in the air, "My father Time is weak and gray, while with waiting for a better day. See how idiot-like he stands, fumbling with his palsied hands. He has had child after child, and the dust of death is piled over every one but me. Misery, oh misery." Then she lay down in the street right before the horse's feet, expecting with a patient eye murder, fraud, and anarchy. When between her toes and her when between her and her foes a mist, a light, an image rose, small at first and weak and frail, like the vapor of a veil, till as clouds grow on the blast, like tower-crowned giants striding fast, and glare with lightnings as they fly, and speak in thunder to the sky, it grew, a shape arrayed in mail, brighter than the viper's scale, and upborne on wings whose grain was as the light of sunny rain. On its helm, seen far away, a planet like the morning's lay, and those plumes its light rained through, like a shower of crimson dew. With step as soft as wind it's passed o'er the heads of men so fast that they knew the present there and looked, but all was empty air. As flowers beneath May's footstep waken, and stars from night's loose hair are shaken, as waves arise when loud winds call, thoughts sprung where'er that step did fall. And the prostrate multitude looked, an ankle deep in blood, Hope, that maiden most serene, was walking with a quiet mien. And Anarchy, the ghastly birth, lay dead earth upon the earth. The horse of death, tameless as wind, fled, and with his hoofs did grind to dust the murderer's throng behind. A rushing light of clouds and splendor, of sense awakening and yet tender, was heard and felt, and at its close these words of joy and fear arose, as if their own indignant earth, which gave the sons of England birth, had felt their blood upon her brow, and shuddering with a mother's throe, had turned every drop of blood by which her face had been bedewed to an accent unwithstood, as if her heart had cried aloud, "Men of England, heirs of glory, heroes of unwritten story, nurslings of one mighty mother, hopes of her and one another, rise like lions after slumber in unvanquishable number, shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few." What is freedom? You can tell that which slavery is too well, for its very name has grown to an echo of your own. 'Tis to work and have such pay as just keeps life from day to day in your limbs, as in a cell, for the tyrants used to dwell. So that ye for them are made, loom and plow and sword and spade, with or without your own will bent to their defense and nourishment. 'Tis to see your children weak, with their mothers pine and peak, when the winter winds are bleak, they are dying whilst I speak. 'Tis to hunger for such diet as the rich man in his riot casts to the fat dogs that lie surfeiting beneath his eye. 'Tis to let the ghost of gold take from toil 1,000-fold more than e'er its substance could in the tyrannies of old. Paper coin, that forgery of the title deeds, which you hold to something of the worth of the inheritance of earth. 'Tis to be a slave in soul, and to hold no strong control over your own wills, but be all that others make of ye. And at length when ye complain, with a murmur weak and vain, 'tis to see the tyrant's crew ride over your wives and you, blood is on the grass like dew. than it is to feel revenge, fiercely thirsting to exchange blood for blood and wrong for wrong. Do not thus when ye are strong. Birds find rest in narrow nest when weary of their winged quest. Beasts find fare in woody lair when storm and snow are in the air. Asses, swine have litter spread and with fitting food are fed. All things have a home but one. Thou, O Englishman, hast none. This is slavery. Savage men or wild beasts within a den would endure not as ye do, but such ills they never knew. What art thou, freedom? Oh, could slaves answer from their living graves this demand, tyrants would flee like a dream's dim imagery. Thou art not, as impostors say, a shadow soon to pass away, a superstition and a name echoing from the cave of fame. For the laborer thou art bred, and a comely table spread, from his daily labor come in a neat and happy home. Thou art clothes and fire and food for the trampled multitude. No, in countries that are free, such starvation cannot be, as in England now we see. To the rich thou art a check, when his foot is on the neck of his victim, thou dost make that he treads upon a snake. Thou art justice, ne'er for gold may their righteous laws be sold as laws are in England. Thou shieldest alike the high and low. Thou art wisdom. Freemen never dream that God will damn forever all who think those things untrue, of which the priests make such ado. Thou art peace. Never by thee would blood and treasure wasted be, as tyrants wasted them, when all ligged to quench thy flame in gall. What if English toil and blood was poured forth even as a flood? It availed, O liberty, to dim, but not extinguish thee. Thou art love. The rich have kissed thy feet, and like him following Christ, give their substance to the free, and through the rough world follow thee, or turn their wealth to arms, and wage war for thy beloved's sake, on wealth and war and fraud, whence they drew the power which is their prey. Science, poetry, and thought are thy lamps. They make the lot of the dwellers in a cot so serene they curse it not. Spirit, patience, gentleness, all that can adorn and bless art thou. Let deeds, not words, express thy exceeding loveliness. Let a great assembly be of the fearless and the free, on some spot of English ground where the plains stretch wide around. Let the blue sky overhead, the green earth on which ye tread, all that must eternal be, witness the solemnity. From the corners uttermost of the bonds of English coast, from every hut, village, and town, where those who live and suffer moan for others' misery or their own, from the workhouse and the prison, where pale as corpses newly risen, women, children, young and old, groan for pain and weep for cold. From the haunts of daily life, where is waged the daily strife, with common wants and common cares, which sows the human heart with tears. Lastly, from the palaces, where the murmur of distress echoes like the distant sound of a wind alive around. Those prison walls of wealth and fashion, where some few feel such compassion for those who groan and toil and wail, as must make their brethren pale. Ye who suffer woes untold, or to feel or to behold your lost country bought and sold with a price of blood and gold, let a vast assembly be, and with great solemnity declare with measured words that ye are, as God has made ye, free. Be your strong and simple words, keen to wound as sharpened swords, and wide as targets let them be, with their shade to cover ye. Let the tyrants pour around with a quick and startling sound, like the loosening of a sea, troops of armed and blazonry. Let the charged artillery drive till the dead air seems alive with the clash of clanging wheels and the tramp of horses' heels. Let the fixed bayonet gleam with sharp desire to whet its bright point in English blood, looking keen as one for food. Let the horsemen's scimitars wheel and flash like sphereless stars, thirsting to eclipse their burning in a sea of death and mourning. Stand ye calm and resolute, like a forest close and mute, with folded arms and looks which are weapons of unvanquished war. And let panic, who outspeeds the career of armed steeds, pass, a dust-regarded shade, through your phalanx undismayed. Let the laws of your own land, good or ill, between you stand, hand to hand and foot to foot, arbiters of the dispute, the old laws of England, they whose reverend heads with age are gray, children of a wiser day, and whose solemn voice must be thine own echo, liberty. Of those who first should violate such sacred heralds in their state, rest the blood that must ensue, for it will not rest on you. And if then the tyrants dare, let them ride among you there, slash and stab and maim and hew. What they like, that let them do. With folded arms and steady eyes, a little fear and less surprise, look upon them as they slay till their rage has died away. Then they will return with shame to the place from which they came, and the blood thus shed will speak in hot blushes on their cheek. Every woman in the land will point at them as they stand. They will hardly dare to greet their acquaintance in the street. And the bold true warriors who have hugged danger and wars will turn to those who would be free, ashamed of such base company. And that slaughter to the nations shall steam up like inspiration, eloquent, oracular, a volcano heard afar. And these words shall then become like oppression's thundered doom, ringing through each heart and brain, heard again, again, again. Rise like lions after slumber in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few. That's The Mask of Anarchy, described as the greatest political poem ever written in English. Aldous Huxley noted long ago the poem's exhortation to the English to resist assault without fighting back. The method of resistance inculcated in by Shelley in The Mask of Anarchy, wrote Huxley, is the method of nonviolence. Author, educator, and activist Howard Zinn refers to the poem in A People's History of the United States. In a subsequent interview, he underscored the power of the poem, suggesting, quote, "What a remarkable affirmation of the power of people who seem to have no power. Ye are many, they are few. It has always seemed to me that poetry, music, literature contribute very special power." Close quote. In particular, Zinn uses The Mask of Anarchy as an example of literature that members of the American labor movement would read to other workers to inform and educate them. The rallying language of the poem had led to elements of its being used by political movements. It was recited by students in the Tiananmen Square protests of 1989 and by protesters in Tahrir Square during the Egyptian Revolution of 2011. Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the British Labour Party today, quoted the final stanza from the poem at his rally in Islington on the final day of campaigning for the 2017 UK general election. Corbyn subsequently quoted the final stanza again during a speech at the Pyramid Stage in the 2017 Glastonbury Festival. Academic and writer John Sutherland has suggested the title of the Labour Party's 2017 manifesto, "For the Many, Not the Few," was derived from the poem. The phrase, "a community in which power, wealth, and opportunity are in the hands of the many, not the few," also appears in the revised version of Clause 4 of the Labor Party Constitution. Author, educator, and activist Howard Zinn refers to the poem in A People's History of the United States, as I mentioned. What a remarkable affirmation of the power of people who seem to have no power. Ye are many, they are few. You're watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort, a local Champaign-Urbana peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at midday on Tuesday, March 26th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world, and the racism we display to those we're killing, in accord with the Latin proverb, proprium mane ingeni est, odissi cum laesaris. It's human nature to hate those you have injured. International polls show that it's the United States that is by far the most feared government in the world, not Russia, China, Iran, or Israel. The wars the United States is waging in 8 countries and its war provocations against Russia and China risk a wider, even a nuclear war. Although most Americans aren't aware of it, the U.S. government is today making war, killing people, in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. They're doing so principally to control the flow of oil to the Mideast and North Africa, which the U.S. uses as a weapon against its economic rivals from Germany to China. The ongoing drone assassination program, called the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times, has killed thousands of people, most of them not the presumed targets, including American citizens and hundreds of children. More than 250,000 American troops, 250,000 of American troops, are stationed in 1,000 U.S. bases on foreign soil, most of them surrounding Russia and China. No other country has more than a dozen foreign military bases. China has 1. The 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command, soldiers, military people, are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities have included kidnapping, the U.S. government calls it rendition, and torture. Since 1945, the United States has killed between 20 and 30 million people in wars in Korea, Vietnam, the Mideast, and elsewhere, designed to maintain the worldwide economic dominance that the U.S. inherited at the end of World War II. It's unfortunately the basis of U.S. foreign policy to use war, the threats of war, to retard the economic development of Russia and China as competitors to American control of the world economy. From U.S. support for a fascist coup in Ukraine to U.S. naval provocations in the South China Sea and huge NATO military exercises in Eastern Europe. The rest of the world recognizes that the U.S. government is what Martin Luther King called it long ago, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. With other peace groups around the world, we call upon President Trump and our government to close all foreign military bases, bring all U.S. troops and weapons home, and provide social supports, including free medical care, education, and a universal basic income for Americans who've been made poor by generations of our government's wars. It's astonishing that in spite of Trump's anti-war moves from Korea to Syria to Afghanistan, the U.S. political establishment is hysterical to get rid of him, and the permanent government continuously undermines these erratic peace moves. The answer for that is because it's Trump's anti-war moves from Korea to Syria, etc., that the U.S. political establishment is hysterical to get rid of him. U.S. foreign policy, as the Obama presidency demonstrates, is based on using war and war provocations to retard Eurasian integration and prevent the rise of what the American foreign policy establishment calls peer competitors, that is, China and Russia. Their economic expansion is met by American military provocation. Trump criticized, and to some extent at the beginning of his presidency, acted against that fundamental principle. So in the eyes of the American establishment, he has to be driven from office before he can do more damage. In fact, he has been largely tamed to the principles of American foreign policy and directly undermined, as in the discussions with North Korea, by that permanent government, which insists that its permanent foreign policy be respected and which he seemed to threaten. You're watching Aware on the Air. We're talking about American war making, and I have a collection of notes from our chief researcher, J.B. Nicholson, who has done a remarkable job of drawing together important items that in some cases have been mentioned but often not in a busy week of American news. He begins with Russiagate and what we know so far of Mueller's report, the investigation of Russiagate. We know that mostly from Attorney General Barr's summary of that report, but what it does is make the Russiagate supporters, those who said Trump was Putin's puppet, following the foreign policy of the Russian government rather than the American establishment. It makes those supporters look irrational, incapable of serious analysis, or biased for partisan, possibly corporatist ends. I think Jeff Nicholson is perhaps too mild here in terms of seeing what the permanent government was doing with Russiagate, but whatever it was, it's certainly exploded now. Some people saw that for a long time before. Robert Scheer, for example, wrote for the show Redacted Tonight earlier in the year, or earlier in the month, in a discussion with Stephen Cohen, the Russia expert. Scheer said, "So my last question to you is, when I look at this situation, the reason I say it's so nutty, Professor Cohen, it seems to me Putin is the guy who got screwed over, whatever he'd hoped to gain by Trump winning. Russia still has sanctions. NATO's still moving very close to their heartland. Arms control agreements are being torn asunder. And so as opposed to, for example, Israel, which has got Trump's foreign policy vis-a-vis Iran, for example, is got it as it is Netanyahu's policy. What did Putin get from this?" Stephen Cohen answered. He says that, in fact, in Russia, Putin is criticized for this, that, in fact, he has gotten nothing from the supposed entente with Trump. I mean, first of all, the Kremlin did not do anything to help put Trump in the White House. There's zero evidence. Moreover, there are maybe a half a dozen major newspapers in Russia that are close to the Kremlin. So if you want to know what the debates are inside the Kremlin, inside the 30 or 4 people, the collective Putin, as it's called in Russia, you read these newspapers. And during the electoral presidential campaign in 2016, in these Russian newspapers, there's a grave uncertainty of which candidate would be better for Russia, Trump or Clinton. And I must say that was reflected by people in America who were not swept up in the propaganda campaign from the Democrats after Trump's election and really raised questions about which presidential candidate would be better in avoiding the war provocations that the permanent government was setting out for Russia and China. There are some people like Noam Chomsky who really thought that Clinton would be better, and apparently still does. This whole Russiagate, the whole hysteria, is a way of avoiding a serious inquiry into what ails us, what ails our foreign policy. The clarity of the moment requires recognizing this rot at the core. Caitlin Johnstone wrote, "The Robert Mueller investigation, which monopolized political discourse for 2 years, is finally concluded, and his anxiously awaited report has been submitted to Attorney General William Barr. The results are in, and the debate is over. Those advancing the conspiracy theory that the Kremlin had infiltrated the highest levels of the U.S. government were wrong, and those of us voicing skepticism of this were right. The contents of the report are still secret, but CNN's Justice Department reporter, Laura Jarrett, has told us all we need to know. Remember, CNN is properly described in many places as the Clinton news network, that it was down with the Russiagate program from the beginning. Their Justice Department reporter nevertheless tweeted, "Special Counsel Mueller is not recommending any further indictments." On top of that, William Barr said in a letter to congressional leaders that there had been no obstruction of Mueller's investigation by Justice Department officials. Caitlin Johnstone rightly ends with, "We must never let them forget what they did or what they cost us all. We must never let mainstream Democrats forget how crazy they got, how much time and energy they wasted, how very, very wrong they were, and how very, very right we were. Never stop reminding them of this. Never stop mocking them for it. Never stop mocking their idiotic Rachel Maddow worship. Never stop mocking the Robert Mueller prayer candles. Never stop making fun of the way they blamed all their problems on Susan Sarandon. Never stop reminding them of those stupid pink vagina hats. Never stop mocking them for elevating Louise Minch and Eric Garland. Never stop mocking them for creating the Krassenstein brothers. Every politician, every media figure, every Twitter pundit, and everyone who swallowed this moronic nonsense has officially discredited themselves for life. She's talking, of course, of the whole Russiagate conspiracy line. Going forward, authority and credibility rest solely with those kept clear eyes and clear heads during the mass media propaganda blitzkrieg, not with those who were stupid enough to believe what they were told about the behaviors of a non-compliant government in a post-Iraq invasion world. The people who steered us into 2 years of Russia vape insanity are the very last people anyone would ever listen to again when determining the future direction of our world." Close quote. The whole article is worth reading, Caitlin Johnstone's analysis, and we'll post that on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air. It's schadenfreude for those who exposed Russiagate for what it always was. Another article worth looking at is by Matt Taibbi in Rolling Stone, which does something similar. That, too, I'll post on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air. Taibbi writes, "There's no part of this conspiracy theory that makes the media look good. Russiagate has been debunked since it started. The Russiagate promoters championed the CIA and FBI. Suddenly those organizations were good, and essentially hoisted themselves by their own petard when Mueller's report didn't result in recommending indicting any Americans. William Barr's summary is enough to let us know that more people will now have to admit the fraudulence of Russiagate. Corporate and corporate-compatible media can't be taken seriously, again, and for more good reasons. The WMDs Mueller lied to Congress about at the time of the Iraq invasion, and the world was bad enough. What helped get an illegal and unethical invasion and occupation going? Now the Russiagate conspiracy theory piles on evidence against the media." Glenn Greenwald article not only points to Taibbi's article above as required reading, a well-deserved recommendation, but points to Greenwald's patient debunking of David K. Johnston's distracting and dissembling attempt to avoid admitting he stopped engaging his critical thinking skills on Russiagate. It's nothing but embarrassment for Johnston, who, like some other Russiagaters, had done good journalism in the past. Marcy Wheeler and Rachel Maddow weren't always nutty and desperate sycophants. What prevented me from writing anything is that Matt Taibbi brilliantly wrote everything I wanted to say in his definitive article on the debacle, one that I urge everyone to read. It lays out in disputable, horrific detail the media's indescribably and relentlessly reckless behavior over the last 3 years, whereby they abused and exploited valid fears of Trump to sell for their own profit and benefit completely false and baseless conspiracy theories that have now been completely debunked by their own anointed authority. I won't excerpt any parts of it because it should be read in full, as many people have done, by as many people as possible. As Taibbi writes, while the Iraq War was far worse in terms of impact, at least thus far, the media's endless series of deceitful and manipulative behavior and spreading of blatantly false conspiracy theories since 2016 was far worse. In sum, Rachel Maddow is the Judy Miller of the Trump-Russia story. Miller was the New York Times reporter who promoted the WMD theory and the American attack on Iraq. In sum, Rachel Maddow is the Judy Miller of the Trump-Russia story, except that unlike Miller, who was scapegoated for behavior that many of her male colleagues also engaged in, to the point where her career and reputation was destroyed, Maddow, who makes $10 million a year from NBC, is too valuable a corporate brand and too much of a liberal celebrity for any consequences or accountability to be permitted. Another difference is that Maddow was so far more frequently off the deep end, way off the deep end, in another universe totally devoid of basic rationality than Miller ever was. Also read Glenn Greenwald's debate with David K. Johnston on Democracy Now! Although Greenwald is too kind to admit it, Amy Goodman on Democracy Now! Is also a Russiagator who has some explaining to do. Goodman passed along unchallenged Russiagate narrative in her headlines, the exact opposite of what she did for pro-Iraq invasion headlines from the New York Times before the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq. Johnston isn't the only one in this interview making most media coverage look show-stoppingly bad here. Greenwald continues to debunk and not let Johnston's repeated attempt at distraction take over the debate. Meanwhile, there are some journalists who came out of the matter with a great deal of honor, Aaron Mattei probably being at the top of the list. A critical mind with good reasoning skills is worth more than millions in media coverage if your goal is to reach a defensible understanding of current events. Jimmy Dore and Aaron Mattei took an earned victory lap, as Dore called it, basking in the glow that they were right on Russiagate from the start, and Dore's small-time operation run out of his garage is bringing better views on Russiagate to the public than organizations that have millions of dollars to spend and a huge full-time staff to do research. One important point few bring up. There's strong evidence to back the idea that Democrats are more interested in stopping progressives than they are in foreign policy and domestic policy, I might add, foreign policy notably here, than they are in losing the presidency to Trump again. Democrats are chasing the same sources of money as the Republicans and therefore have the same masters with the same goals. That's why the corporate duopoly can be so effective in deceiving the public into believing they're oppositional parties. Of all the biggest issues of the day, war chief among them, they're not opposed. You're watching War on the Air. We're talking about the news of war and the prospects of war around the world, Russiagate and the destruction of the Russiagate campaign by the Democrats, the intelligence agencies, and the permanent government of the United States being the top story of the week. There are some others that are related to it in one way, notably the visit of the Chinese President Xi, to Italy and now on to France. Italy has signed up with the Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese expansion of economic connections throughout Eurasia. This is extremely worrisome to the U.S.-led economic dominance that we call globalism, and the U.S. press is doing its best to cover over what actually is happening here. And this last week, this conjunction between China and Italy. Italy has a populist government, and against the wishes of Brussels, that is the EU, and Washington, that is the U.S., Italy is making arrangements to be included in China's Belt and Road system, and that's making the lights burn late in Foggy Bottom in the State Department in Washington these days. There is a similar story here in regard to the American assault on Venezuela. Venezuela this week has done oil deals with two huge buyers, China and India. This is said to replace oil deals with the U.S. and others the U.S. can convince to help starve Venezuela. Another note on the Russiagate business and its comparison with the lies of the American government leading up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. We don't have clear figures on this now, but it looks like more people have died due to the lies of Iraqi WMDs than the lies of Russiagate. However, the corporate and corporate-friendly media remained untrustworthy on this issue just the same. Independent media and RT, Russian state-owned media, led the way to properly understanding Russiagate. If you want to look back at the coverage and so forth, that's clear now. I don't think too many people will actually do that. I mentioned Aaron Maté as one of the leading Americans debunking the Russiagate stories. Maté left two news outlets because of Russiagate, that is Democracy Now! And the Real News Network, which should have been in the forefront of criticizing Russiagate, as Maté was. But his criticism led to his leaving, I'm not sure fired is quite right, but led to his leaving Democracy Now! And the Real News Network, who should have been in the forefront of criticizing Russiagate. RT, which relates to the Russian government roughly the way the BBC relates to the British government, RT is among the few outlets with a series of stories debunking Russiagate since Russiagate began. Go back and look at that again. It's largely accurate. Russiagate is also a basis, however, a basis for anti-Russian sanctions, and sanctions are by the U.S., and sanctions are economic war against the poor. This and ramping up war spending and provocations between two nuclear countries are far more important than helping Hillary Clinton dodge the blame for a second losing presidential campaign. That's the reason the U.S. are doing them. The U.S. government is, and the 1% particularly, are pressing on the Russiagate nonsense. Democracy Now!, the BBC, the CBC, belong to the set of Russiagate-friendly outlets. They've all been complicit in uncritically passing on Russiagate stories. Don't expect them, however, to correct their errors. For example, it is reported without contestation in most of these mainstream media outlets that the Russians gave the Democratic National Committee emails to WikiLeaks. That's not even a matter of discussion, and it seems to be absolutely false. It emerges again in the wake of the Mueller report. The special counsel found that the Russian government actors successfully hacked into computers and obtained emails from persons affiliated with the Clinton campaign and Democratic Party organizations and publicly disseminated those materials through various intermediaries, including WikiLeaks. That's the CNN account taken as gospel. It's more than likely false and certainly should be reported as questionable. The details on backing this claim are missing. I know of no solid evidence that necessarily includes any Russians in the DNC email leaks. If Bill Benny's team's conclusions are true, that the DNC didn't have a fast enough this is a technical analysis, didn't have a fast enough network uplink to account for someone from Russia remotely obtaining these emails directly from relevant DNC server, there's no technical need for Russians to be involved in the DNC email leaks at all. It's possible that someone at the Democratic National Committee, probably Seth Rich, copied the emails to another drive, like a USB thumb drive, and uploaded data to WikiLeaks from the copy on that other drive. However, it's up to the U.S. government to make their case that it was the Russians, and WikiLeaks presumably knows who gave the copy of the data WikiLeaks published, but of course the U.S. is busily persecuting and shutting up WikiLeaks and notably Julian Assange. There's an example here of good American reporters being completely bamboozled and turned aside by the Russiagate nonsense. I don't apply that description quite to Rachel Maddow, but I might apply it to Marcy Wheeler, who has blogged for many years under the title Empty Wheel. She seems mad as hell that Russiagate looks like it's going off. She's had a personal and vitriolic relationship with Russiagate debunker Aaron Maté, and our researcher suggests that she might want to delete some of those tweets right now. She must be concerned that Mueller has filed a report with 0 additional indictments, 0 indictments alleging collusion, as been the long-time buzzword of Russiagate, and 0 indictments alleging whatever Marcy Wheeler would be more comfortable calling it instead of collusion. I also speculate Wheeler is getting away with posting things I doubt would have been tolerated if any man had posted about her. Maté, quote, is and remains a bozo who, quote, invented stuff, close quote. Well, perhaps not. It's important that the basis of the accounts that most Americans are getting in these matters be revealed for what they are. Our researcher, Jeff Nicholson, finally, out of exasperation, has collected a file of repeated headlines from this group. Beginning of the end, walls are closing in, tipping point, turning point, bombshell, President Trump is underwater. You read all of these as the headlines for months, the Mueller report being the dagger which would bring them all to the heart of the Trump presidency, and that turns out not to be the case. I think it's a good choice of Caitlin Johnstone to cite CNN on this. CNN rightly called fake news by the president and so much of the public for its unending Russiagate support. CNN, Clinton News Network, some call it, now has to admit their lying warmonger of choice, that is Robert Mueller. Remember, he helped to lie the U.S. into invading Iraq in 2003, is telling them that Russiagate was never a story backed in facts. And another CNN talking head, Van Jones, told someone he thought he was talking too confidently. The whole Russia thing is a big nothing burger, close quote. Well, yes. Aware runs a couple of mailing lists, email lists, one called Peace and the other called Peace Discuss. The Peace list is considered an announcement list, but it has been rather tightly held by people in the Aware organization so that the discussion, which many times flew against this sort of Russiagate nonsense and the Trump is the problem approach, discussions at that point weren't aired. We'll hope now maybe Aware will live up to its name a little more and try to make people a little more aware of what's going on in these matters to its local Champaign-Urbana clientele. Jeff Nicholson, our researcher, is a bit more acerbic about the matter than I. He writes, I'm also not sure I see a reason for the peace list to exist. If it's strictly for announcing upcoming Aware meetings, then that list should be renamed to something that makes sense, like Aware Meetings announcements. If that mailing list aims to address some alleged low bandwidth need of peace discuss, I say that's nonsense. Mail accounts have plenty of space these days. Users commonly use webmail, and text-only email still works fine, even over slow dial-up modems, if anyone even uses a dial-up modem anymore. Catering to low bandwidth just doesn't describe a viable modern need, but sounds more like a cover for ad hoc censorship. Moderators pass through messages they like and withhold messages they don't because they have that power, close quote. That's Jeff Nicholson's analysis from afar. He may be right. Back in November of 2016, the American people were so fed up with the neoliberal oligarchy that everyone knows really runs the country that they actually elected Donald Trump president. They did this fully aware that Trump was a repulsive, narcissistic ass clown who bragged about grabbing women by their privates and jabbered about building a big, beautiful wall and making the Mexican government pay for it. They did this fully aware of the fact that Donald Trump had zero experience in any political office whatsoever, was a loudmouth bigot, and was possibly out of his gourd on amphetamines half the time. The American people did not care. They were so disgusted with being conned by arrogant, two-faced establishment stooges like the Clintons, the Bushes, and Barack Obama that they chose to put that they chose to put Donald Trump in office. Because after all, what did they have to lose? The global capitalist ruling classes are putting down a populist insurgency, delegitimizing any and all forms of dissent from their global capitalist ideology and resistance to the hegemony of global capitalism. In the process, they're conditioning people to completely abandon their critical faculties and behave like twitching Pavlovian idiots who will obediently respond to whatever stimuli or blatantly fabricated propaganda the corporate media bombards them with. Finally today, I want to comment on a rather different voice, that of Tulsi Gabbard, the Hawaiian congressperson who's running for president, and suggests that her situation is not entirely clear, to put it mildly. Jeff Nicholson, our researcher, and I disagree a bit on how seriously to take Gabbard, but she has made a number of statements and public appearances recently that with some difficulty we've got access to, and Jeff writes about them as follows. This is led, by the way, in that same mailing list I was talking about a moment ago, to a discussion about America's ongoing drone wars, although President Obama used drones remarkably across the world to assassinate presumed enemies of the United States, even in countries the United States was not officially at war with, remembering, of course, there aren't any countries that America is officially at war with under American law. The wars carried on by the killings, the assassinations carried on by the Obama presidency, the Trump presidency, are vastly illegal. They are war crimes. for which people should be prosecuted. But it's been suggested that opposition to the drone wars, the drone assassinations of this and the last administration is fundamentally irrational. Jeff Nicholson has the job of pointing out that Tulsi Gabbard has, at least in part, sanctioned these wars. He says, I stand by what I wrote earlier. Nothing in what Gabbard says addresses what I've written about her stance on deployment, occupation, and drone war. But I like other things she says. I think she needs some more domestic policy issues in her platform, support for a national jobs program, for example. And there's plenty of time to add new issues and address anything she said before. Ultimately, I don't think it's likely the Democratic Party establishment will let Gabbard represent that party. Pardon me. I think he's quite right about that. Democratic Party elites appear to prefer Kamala Harris and Joe Biden. Harris fulfills their identity politics desires and has a strong record of standing for corporate prisons, Obamacare, vacuous public campaign statements, that is Obamacare instead of what we should have, which is Medicare for all. Vacuous public campaign statements. Her first campaign ad is issueless and thus presents no threat to corporatism so far. She's also being interviewed very lightly on her past marijuana proclivities. She's not addressing the irony that she could hold the job she's held despite having smoked cannabis, while today's job seekers can't get employed if they're caught illegally smoking weed. And Champaign people can even be refused rental housing on that basis. There is much more about the discussion of Gabbard. We will post that to the Facebook page for Aware on the Air. Well, the final point that we should talk about tonight, and don't really quite have time to, is the Medicare for All proposal that Gabbard seems to be backing, and that in various ways other Democratic hopefuls actually are moving towards, while the Trump administration is trying to see that the courts will throw out the ACA, Obamacare, in toto. So there's much more that needs to be said about that. You have been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. I want to finish tonight with a letter to the editor in today's News Gazette by someone unknown to me, who's not a member of Aware, so far as I know. It's headlined in the News Gazette today, "Why No Apologies for Airstrikes?" The News Gazette published a March 16th article about the mosque shooting in New Zealand, writing that Trump tweeted Friday that his warmest sympathy and best wishes go out to the people of New Zealand about the horrible massacre in the mosques, close quote. I hope that Trump, and indeed all Americans, will also condemn the horrible massacres in mosques carried out by the United States itself. On March 16, 2017, the United States conducted airstrikes on the Omar ibn al-Khattab Mosque near Al-Jinnah, Syria. According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, the airstrike had killed at least 49 people and wounded dozens, mostly civilians, who were attending a religious lesson. Pentagon spokesman Jeff Davis, however, said that, quote, dozens of al-Qaeda fighters were killed in a Thursday strike by manned and unmanned U.S. aircraft on an al-Qaeda meeting place in the village of Al-Jinnah, Aleppo, close quote. But Human Rights Watch disputes this in a report on the airstrikes from April 2017, writing that after its own investigation, it, quote, has not found evidence to support the allegations that the mosque was a meeting place for members of al-Qaeda in Syria or any other armed group. The Pentagon's position is implausible. We massacred civilians in a mosque. We readily condemn the massacres carried out by others, but refuse even to think about the massacres we carried out ourselves. It seems that yet again we find that we Americans are a nation radically consumed by hypocrisy. And this letter in today's News Gazette is signed by Andrew Smith of Champaign. You've been listening to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana. Inshallah, we'll be back next week to give you a new account of the war news that you're not hearing for the most part in American media. This is Carl Estabrook saying goodnight for members and friends of Aware.